Hello, good evening, kia ora, good morning, good afternoon. You know the drill. I go through it every time as I try and work out exactly what time of day or evening it is to any of you that are actually watching, tuned in, listening. Something really special for you tonight, folks. It is my absolute pleasure to have here with me live to talk to you, the delightful, the wonderful, the amazing Meg Keneally. Now, Meg is a fellow author of Echo Publishing and Bonnier Publishing with me. She's in Sydney and I'm in Melbourne. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her books because I know that everyone out there that's tuning in, well, you're fans of historical fiction. Well, guess what? That's what Meg writes. And for any of you not in Australia who don't know of her and her writing, everyone in Australia does, of course, but she writes historical fiction set in Australia. So if you want to know a little bit more about the development and how this country came to be, specifically from the perspective of women, then I'm going to show you two books and recommend that you get them. So thank you, Meg. Welcome. Hello.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather, and congratulations on Stories of Hope. It's just what we need right now.
Well, yes, that's true. And well, each day we get a little bit more hope, don't we, in Australia? But for a lot of the people who are watching this, they haven't quite got there yet. And it's going to be perhaps a long winter for a lot of people in the Northern Hemisphere. And, you know, we're going to be thinking about you because we've been through it. It was our winter. And just come out of it safe on the other side.
Yeah.
But anyway, it is just wonderful to have this lovely lady. I am going to monopolize the next couple of minutes while I just tell you a little bit about her. Now, I could just spiel off who she is and what she is, or I can just go and read the little bio in the front of her book. So I get it right. I can stumble. Like, here we go. Meg Keneally worked as a public affairs officer, sub-editor, freelance feature writer, reporter, and talkback radio producer. Wow. Before co-founding a financial service public relations company, which she then sold after having her first child. For more than 10 years, Meg has worked in corporate affairs for listed financial services companies and doubles as a part-time scuba diving instructor.
Vitamin C, very important.
Yes, you would have had to learn that, wouldn't you? Well, Meg is a co-author with Tom Keneally of The Soldier's Curse and The Unmourned, the first two books in the Montserrat series. Her first solo novel was Fled, folks. And The Wreck is her second. Now, I don't know, Meg, if you want me to finish it off and let the people know that you live in Sydney with your husband and two children. If you don't, well, just let me know and we'll delete it, okay?
No, that's fine. I live in Sydney with my husband and two children.
There you go, folks, it's out there.
And something in the roof, which is probably a possum.
Oh, yeah. We do have those here in Australia, and while Australians think they're lovely little critters, for me, growing up in New Zealand, they were not lovely little critters.
They're gorgeous.
Yeah, and I won't go any further with me and possums.
Okay. That's for another time then.
Look, thank you. I could roughly tell people about, say, Fled, for example, and give a brief sort of rundown on it. But you share a little bit about why you've told this story and roughly what it's about.
The story of Fled, it's a story that's always fascinated me. And I first heard of it when I was about 7 years old and we were living in America, and my mum and dad decided to take us out of school for 6 months and drive us around the US in a camper van. So we were van schooled. And this was in the days before iPads. So parents had to be super creative in stopping the siblings from murdering one another. And my sister and I think came very close on various occasions. And the way my father, who's a long-time storyteller, did it was, of course, by telling us stories. And one of the stories he told me was of Mary Bryant. And this was interspersed with stories of talking volcanoes and other wonders. So I just assumed at the time that it was something else Dad had made up because that's what he did. When I became an adult, I decided to look into Mary Bryant. And I was surprised to find he hadn't embellished at all, because he is an embellisher by natural inclination. So this is a woman who was a highwaywoman in Cornwall, who was caught and transported as part of the First Fleet. And for those who are watching from countries outside Australia, this was the first lot of convicts that was sent to Australia by Britain. It was an extraordinary voyage. It must have been like going to Mars. They were so far away from everything. They knew no prospect of getting back. So she was part of this group of convicts that was transported to Australia. She was a feisty woman, and she decided that the only hope of survival for her and her children was to steal the governor's cutter and sail it, as you do, to East Timor, about 3,000 miles, I believe. After that, she had, I won't put in any spoilers, but she had various other tragedies and adventures to go along with that. And I just thought, what must it have taken for this woman to do that? Why would she have put her children in such danger? Obviously, she felt she had no other choice. And what gave her the courage to undertake this incredible journey in a small open boat over that period, over that distance? It took 69 days. It's remarkable that anyone survived, let alone all of them did. So I was just entranced with her courage and her fortitude and her resourcefulness. And I often find when I'm writing about historical figures and what they go through, I think I would so be dead by now.
But you don't write about Mary Bryant. Well, you do write about Mary Bryant, but you tell us the story of Jenny.
Jenny Trelawny, because I decided it was something I wrestled with about whether to call her Mary Bryant or whether to call her Jenny. And there were two reasons I decided to call her Jenny instead. The first is that when you're writing a novel, you can't, even if it's historical fiction, you can't lose sight of the fact that you are primarily there to tell a story, and you want to tell an engaging one. And while you need to render the facts and the environment and the world of the story as accurately as possible, sometimes you do need to tweak things slightly. And I'll give you an example. There were 11 people in the boat that Mary Bryant escaped in. I've got 6 in the boat that Jenny escaped in. And the reason for that is that every character needs to earn their place on the page. They need to be doing something to move the story forward, to advance the plot, or to tell us something about the protagonist, or they need to have some other job. And to give that many narrative roles to that many characters, I would have had a book that would break your toe if you dropped it. So that was one reason. The other reason was that Mary was illiterate, as were so many women in history. And this is one of the reasons why we haven't heard enough, I believe, about women in history, because they couldn't write down their stories. And with Mary, we don't have any record about what she thought and felt about things. We can only judge her by her actions. And of course, her actions seem to indicate that she was no shrinking violet. But I don't know what she believed, what she felt in her heart of hearts, what motivated her. I can only guess. And it felt wrong to put my interpretation into the heart and mind and mouth of a real woman. It felt better to invent a fictional character who could truly own it.
And we are talking about the 1780s here, folks.
Yeah.
We're not talking about anything sort of recent. And though that's Australia's recent history in terms of the convicts and the colonisation of this particular land. But what's also beautiful about your story about Jenny, who, by the way, I love the little snippet in there, who was actually called Jane. That's what she was christened. but that her dad considered that name was too small for such a wild girl, hence the Jenny. But you tell us about, or you introduce the Indigenous people of Australia through her eyes, and you can learn about that part of the 1780s, 90s from this English girl who's now learning, as we all should, from the Indigenous people of this country. So,
yeah, and I struggled with that because I was keenly aware that I was writing about the day everything changed for our Indigenous people in Australia and has never changed back. And it's a day of pain still for many Indigenous people. But at the same time, it would have been dishonest to portray Australia as terra nullius, because it wasn't. There were people here, and the British showed up and said, we'll have this, thank you, and took their land, essentially. So I really wanted to represent that. But also there is historical evidence that Jenny and Mary Bryant and her husband knew Bennelong. And for those outside of Australia, Bennelong was a very important Aboriginal man after whom the point on which the Sydney Opera House is named. And he was a friend of theirs, and he helped when the boat they had been preparing for escape was capsized. He helped stop it being wrecked entirely. So they did have a relationship. They did build a relationship of necessity in this wild place that that was taken from the Aboriginal people.
and here's the great thing about Meg's storytelling too, by the way, folks, that she does the same things that I do, and that's in the back of her books. She gives you author's notes, just like I had to tell you about Lully and what happened to him and his family and all the other people in his story and in Silka's. Meg will tell you about the true Mary Bryant and those other significant people who she names in both the fled and the wreck. The other people and events that happened in Australia that she weaves her stories into. And then go to the back, and then you get that update. Brilliant that you were able to write stories and provide these additional bullet points.
Yeah, oh, thank you. I kind of feel I have an obligation to do that.
Yeah.
If you're not messing around with history, but if you're putting something which actually happened into a fictional story, I do think you have an obligation to say, this is what happened, this is what didn't.
Yeah.
So I will always do author's notes. I think I owe it to my readers, and I take that from when I was about 15. I read a book by Sharon Penman, The Sun in Splendor. And for me, it was about historical fiction about the Wars of the Roses. And what was almost as fascinating to me as the story that she wove was the author's notes at the end, where she speculates about who killed the princes in the tower, for example, and what her research was. And I always thought if I ever wrote historical fiction, I wanted to do that as well.
Oh, absolutely. Because the reality is, we can only get our pictures, and you paint, by the way, incredible pictures with your words, but we cannot understand what it was really like. It's just not possible, is it?
No,
we live here with Zoom and computers and all these things that make our lives very, very comfortable. Mary/Jenny and Sarah in the wreck, that they didn't, and we cannot imagine it. We can only interpret from what we learn.
Yeah.
When I think about writing Lully's story, for example, I did have to make a choice when writing about Auschwitz Birkenau. Do I go there, in 2015 and see that place before I write about it? In which case I will now describe it to you through my eyes, and my eyes come with having lived at this end of the world and never experienced anything remotely like it. But at least here I did have the choice, and I had the man who was there. And so I was able to write with his words and through his eyes. But writing historical fiction, we don't always have that luxury. I did have it in that one instance.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it comes back to like what you say is really important and interesting because we are looking at everything through our own lens. And of course, everything you read can't help but have the author's own conscious or unconscious preferences and biases built into it. That's just every document created by a human has that. So I think the way you get around that as a writer of historical fiction is to never let yourself forget that what you're telling is a human story and that humans actually haven't changed all that much. Our circumstances have changed massively, but we still love, we still fear, we still have the same yearnings and wants and desires as we always have. And I think that when you're writing historical fiction, absolutely the research is important. The veracity of what you say is important, but just as important is that you're telling the story of one human or a couple of humans who are interpreting these events through their own eyes and filtering through their own emotions. And that's what we do as novelists. And if we were doing something else, we'd be historians.
Yes.
We always need to be focused on that human story. And it's funny when I am getting to know a character, and you know yourself, Heather, when you're first writing something, it's a bit of a dance with a character when you're first getting to know them, when you're first putting them on the page and you don't quite know them as well as you would like at first. I have three things always in mind: what they fear, what they love, and what they want.
Yeah.
And with those three things, you can pretty much write your way into understanding the world from this person's point of view.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're the three things that I learned about, by the way, when you're writing screenplays, that's how you develop characters in any sense. But also you've got to remember, I suppose, too, that we're writing for people to read these stories today.
Yes.
And to be able to perhaps have written it in the kind of prose and using the language of the 1780s, it may not be as enjoyable for people to read today. We want that simpler storyline in terms of the language so that we can relate. And it's all about making it relatable.
Yeah.
Just like we haven't lived in the 1780s, and neither have your readers.
No, that's right. And, you know, the language, it's interesting you mentioned that because it's a really fine balance of giving a flavour of the way people would have spoken, but making it accessible.
Yeah.
Because you want to keep people in the world of the story. And you can't do that if they're constantly Googling what you're writing. And I occasionally do school talks to history students. And I show them, my first year English literature lecturer tortured me by making me read Chaucer in original Middle English. And so I see no reason why I shouldn't pass that torture on to today's high school students. So whenever
Yes.
So whenever I do a school talk, I show them the original Chaucer, written in, I think, 1392, the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, and I show them the modern English translation. I think that brings home to them the fact that language has evolved over time and it's still constantly evolving. And sometimes when I hear my children talking, my teenage children, I need to ask them what they mean. You know, what I heard my daughter say to someone the other day, "Oh, you're a mood." I'm like, what?
That's a new one on me.
It's like
in the mood.
Yeah, somebody. If somebody is a mood, apparently it's somebody that you can relate to. It shows you between one generation and the next, language has evolved to the point where I need to ask my daughter for a translation. So of course, language has evolved significantly since the time periods I write in, but I still have an obligation, of course, not to use language which is anachronistic and to use the cadence and the sort of general mannerisms of that period without making it inaccessible.
Absolutely. And when it comes to the wreck, Wonderful, wonderful story.
Thank you.
Meg jumps forward, not too long. She just suddenly it's in the 1820s, so there's not a huge sort of jump in time from Mary/Jenny's story. And again, incredible story of a young girl who, yes, she also finds herself in Australia, but under her getting here and her pretext for getting here is very, very different. She's running away from being charged and convicted as a potential. Well, she was on the wrong side of a rebellion, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was. And she was essentially what you might call a terrorist. So my main character in the wreck, I'll just do the product placement thing here.
We both do it together.
Sarah McCaffrey. I wanted to write about, I think what's been ignored a lot in history is the role of women in agitation and in civil unrest in the past. And there was an event in Manchester in 1819, which is now known as the Peterloo Massacre. And it was an extraordinary event where 60,000 people in a city of 100,000 came to St. Peter's Field in Manchester to listen to a man speak about parliamentary reform, which sounds, yawn. I mean, British Acts of Parliament are not what gets me out of bed in the morning, but what interests me about this event is that it was a peaceful protest, and people brought their children and their families, and they brought picnics, and there were marching bands, and it was real carnival atmosphere. And they came to hear this famous orator talk about how Parliament needed to be reformed to get rid of rotten boroughs and increase enfranchisement and so on and so forth. The magistrates saw the size of the crowd and became panicked. They had already written to the Home Secretary saying, remember the French Revolution, this might happen here as well, or words to that effect. And so they sent in hussars and yeomen who slashed their way through the crowd. And 20 people were dead by the end and hundreds injured. And this event has always stuck with me because it was essentially Britain's Tiananmen Square. And so I wanted to write a story which started with that. And I thought, what would happen to somebody who lost their parents in that, who lost everything? Would they not then want to strike back? Yeah, absolutely. Basic human instinct, because all they were doing was saying, we actually wouldn't mind having our voices heard a bit more, and a bit more to eat would be really good as well.
Was it, please, sir, can I have another piece of bread stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So not an unreasonable request. So my central character, Sarah, loses her parents in that event, and then becomes radicalized and takes part in a plot to overthrow the government. And when that fails, she finds herself on a ship bound for New South Wales. And this is another thing I really wanted to write about. I'm sorry, but I get really nerdy about shipwrecks. I love shipwrecks. And one of them, I'm a keen scuba diver, and one of the shipwreck sites that I dive on frequently is the site of the wreck of the Dunbar. There's nothing left of the Dunbar, by the way. But it was wrecked at the Gap, just about a kilometre outside Sydney Harbour. Having come all that way from England, it drove itself into a cliff, essentially. And there was one survivor. So I have Sarah on a similar wreck. She's the sole survivor. She finds herself in Sydney. She's under an assumed name. She's looking over her shoulder all the time because she knows the authorities in England are looking for her. And she comes under the wing of a woman called Molly Thistle, who's based on Mary Reeby, who is the very grandmotherly looking woman on the Australian $20 note, but who built the most amazing entrepreneurial trade and real estate empire in colonial Australia. How she did that as a woman and a former convict has always fascinated me. So I really wanted to write about her as well.
Fascinating. I just love that you're telling stories of the young girls,
Mm.
Yeah. And clearly that's something I'm driven to be wanting to tell them too. Silka, Ita, young girls. Yeah. Livy, Sibby, Magda, these young girls that I'm writing about now, and learning through their eyes, their resilience, their survival techniques. I'm not sort of saying that they're better than men. They're different. They seem to bring something different to being able to resist and survive incredible tragedy and trauma. And I think maybe because they're not been written about enough. And you and I decided that we're going to write about them.
Yes, absolutely. Their voices deserve to be heard. And you're right, they're not better than men, but they also had to navigate a much harder landscape.
Damn right.
In terms of, I mean, what interested me about Mary Bryant, for example, was how she managed to mastermind this escape by pulling the levers that were available to her, and they were very, very limited. One of the reasons I'm fascinated by Mary Reeby is how she managed to navigate her way through colonial society until suddenly she could buy and sell everyone. And these young women and older women as well show us something about how you take what you're given and you make the most of it. And that's what I really admire about these women. And I don't think I'd have 1/100th of the fortitude that they have, and the women in your books, as well as people like Silka. I mean, they're just extraordinary. What extremist drives people to, it brings out the worst, but it also brings out the best.
And the other aspect to your stories that I love is I wasn't a great studier of history at school. I did not have your dad who could weave and create and fabricate stories real and dreamt up and perceived. And so history for me was something very, very narrow in good old New Zealand, my small town education there. We did learn a little bit about the English history, but only as it related to them coming out and taking over New Zealand. No, that not the same as they did in Australia. So for those folks, once again, outside of Australia and New Zealand, how these two countries were colonised, if we can use that phrase, were very, very different. And how the Indigenous people in both these countries, well, they were kind of treated the same, but in New Zealand, the Maori, well, they were able to rise up. Smaller country, smaller land, only a certain number of tribes. I think it's only a handful of tribes that existed then and still do today. Everyone can trace their iwi to, just one of, I think it's 5 or 6 tribes. And but here it was different for the Indigenous people. They were caught on the back foot, and we could say to this date have not been able to take that step forward. Well, the Maoris, we had things called Maori Wars, and New Zealand was the only country, the only colonised country that Queen Victoria signed a treaty with. They held that over her.
Yeah, so and you're right, it was a very, very different story. And as I said, to this day, I believe the date of Australia Day should be changed because it's a day of pain for so many people. And how can you unify around something that causes pain to so many? But the whole issue of colonisation is something that I've really thought about a lot because I'm writing about that history, and whether I have the right to talk about it as a white Australian, as a descendant of convicts and settlers. It fascinates me. One thing that really struck home when I was researching the wreck, which is set in 1820, and it's not, as you say, not that long after in living memory of the arrival of the First Fleet. But the Sydney of 1820, when I researched it, I found that there were very few Eora Aboriginals left, very few Gadigal left. They had been institutionalised, or they had been slaughtered, or they had been shipped out to the west of New South Wales, and there were some living around, what's now Mascot and Botany in the bush. But there was a brutal and complete erasure of the Eora people in Sydney. Absolutely appalling. And I don't think it was quite the case in New Zealand.
No, it wasn't. There was massacre, but it was actually on both sides.
Yeah.
She's interested that the town that I grew up was not even a town, the hamlet, for want of a better word, that I grew up in, and for 5 generations of my family lived there. It was a little place called Pirongia. It's in the middle of the North Island, and it has a mountain, Mount Pirongia. It's a sleeping volcano, and when I lived there, you can only drive in or out of it. It has a river running through it, the Waipa River, the mighty Waipa, we knew it as. Now, Pirongia initially was called Alexandra. During the Maori Wars, there was an immense battle was fought on that river in Pirongia. That was the only way to get in and out of it, mostly. And the British, they were the ones who were slaughtered there. Their bodies were left on the banks of this river in this little village. And the Maori couldn't understand that the rest of them fled and just left these men, these soldiers to die. As a result of which, they stunk. The smell of death lingered over the town. And so the town, Alexandra, had its name changed to Pirongia, which Maori means bad smell.
Oh, is that right?
So, hey, folks, I grew up in a place called Bad Smell. But these are the differences, as I say, that between the two countries. Here, over there, they were able to mobilise in smaller areas and fight back. But actually, what I was getting to was how much I learned from your books about English history. I mean, I did not know about these rebellions because I did not study history at any level, at tertiary level. And it was limited at school. So just not Australian history. You also teach us, or tell us, not teach, you tell us about some significant English history, which you go, well, that makes sense. I can understand why you could tell a story about Sarah based on a rebellion that really happened, and take those events and draw inspiration from them.
Yeah, well, the rebellion that I have her radicalised by a man who's involved with a group called Spencean Philanthropists, who follows.
Say that again. Go on, I dare you to.
Oh, don't make me. Spencean Philanthropists. How's that? They hatched a plan they found out about a cabinet dinner, and they hatched a plan to storm the dinner and cut off the cabinet members' heads and form a provisional government and put them on spikes on Westminster Bridge. And this was all absolutely true. They found out about the dinner through one of their number who turned out to be a police spy, and so they were all arrested before it could take place. And I thought, I've always been interested in that little sort of hidden nugget of English history as well, because it does have a flow on from the Peterloo Massacre. And I suppose one of the broader things I was trying to get at is it's hard to radicalise somebody who feels heard by their society. Yeah. It's hard to radicalise someone who doesn't feel oppressed, someone who has enough to eat, someone who feels that their rights are by and large protected. So what I really wanted to look at is what happens if you take everything that matters from someone and then present them with a violent alternative. Are they going to grasp onto that? And Sarah does in this.
Yeah. And here's the kicker in it. What's changed?
Well, there's a lot that hasn't, unfortunately. I mean,
we don't chop off people's heads and stick them on spikes anymore.
No,
that's a good thing, folks. No, we're not recommending that for anybody watching. No chopping off heads and putting them on spikes.
I endorse that comment, absolutely. But one of the things that does still happen, for example, is like Peterloo, suppression of peaceful protest. Would you have ever thought that we would see peaceful protesters in Washington in sight of the White House tear gassed?
No.
That sort of thing. And I think one of the things I love about writing historical fiction is that there is so much there that we can grasp onto that tells us about something. It tells us about why we are the way we are today. And occasionally people say to me, why do you write about history when there are so many other current concerns to be dealt with? And I fluff up my feathers like an indignant cockatoo. And once I've smoothed them back down again, I explain that my view is that history is not something discrete that you can rule a line under and wrap in grease paper and pop in a biscuit tin and leave on the shelf. It's something that's reverberating now. And to understand who we are now, we need to understand who we were then. And some of the parallels between the the Peterloo Massacre and current suppression of peaceful protest are quite disturbing. Equally, what was interesting to me when I looked into the female reform societies in Manchester at the time, and they don't get the credit they deserve, but they were agitating for women's rights in 1819. And whenever they spoke in public, they were derided in cartoons as whores or simpletons, and there were cartoon images of them with bare breasts or making double entendres left, right, and centre, and so forth. And it struck me that, you know, the way female leaders are derided actually hasn't changed all that much.
No, we don't have to go far here, do we? Back to a recent female leader, only one really.
Yeah, Julia Gillard, who was referred to as a witch, you know, and that was exactly the same accusation that was levelled at some of the leaders of the reform societies in Manchester in 1819. So we've literally come not 1 centimetre in the past 200 years because female leaders are not judged just in terms of their actions or their leadership. They're judged in terms of their gender, and they're spoken about in very gendered language. And unfortunately, I think that hasn't changed as much in the past 200 years as we would have liked. And I think we do have a tendency to pat ourselves on the back and tell ourselves how far we've come, and we have come.
Hey, I voted in the last election. What's wrong with you? That sort of thing.
Exactly.
Not good enough.
No, exactly. As long as we've got, you know, female leaders being referred to as witches and bitches and so forth, we haven't come far enough.
We've got more to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can, you know, I think it's sometimes really instructive and important to reflect on how far we've come. Certainly, I would absolutely rather be living in 2020 than 1820.
Pandemic included.
Yes. Things like dentistry, antibiotics, as well as, you know, the rights that we do have.
Childbirth, all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think it's instructive to sometimes consider how far we haven't come as well.
Well, we'll keep writing about the females and girls, and I look, everyone tuning into this, they already know what I'm working on, the story of 3 young girls. Are you permitted to share your current workings?
I think I'm permitted to just briefly share the fact that I found the story of a young Polynesian woman educated in Sydney who was torn from her school at the age of 14 to marry the Crown Prince of Tahiti. And she was a great defender of her culture. She went through horrible things, fled to Paris, and eventually came back to try to save Tahiti from colonisation. Was unable to do so and ultimately became the last queen of Tahiti. And this woman's story just fascinates me. So I'm working on that at the moment.
Fantastic. And Meg and I have had conversations which include also Benny. I'm sure she may or may not still be tuned in. It's past her bedtime. But you can watch, if you're watching this tomorrow, Benny, the 3 of us and possibly one other person are planning a trip to Tahiti.
Yes.
You're going there to research. Benny and I and that other person who shan't be named is coming to be our driver and caretaker.
Yes.
We're just going there for the fun of it.
Yeah, and why not? And why not? And I can stagger back after a day's research and we can all have a drink together around the pool.
Look, Meg, it's been such a delight having you chat with me tonight. I'm so grateful for you giving up your time.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to speak to you.
Look, hey folks, you know I love my Facebook events, and I'll be back again in a couple of weeks. And yeah, I'll have somebody else to chat to, and there's going to be a special treat coming up before Christmas in terms of some people connecting and talking to you, and they're people who you've heard me talk about, and you're going to get to see them in the flesh, so to speak. But in the meantime, thank you to everybody that's come and tuned in either live or will watch this down the track. Meg Keneally. Look, I have to finish off by acknowledging who Meg's dad is, because Meg's dad is somebody who I spent an amazing afternoon with doing an event. Thomas Keneally, he who pointed out to the crowd when we were talking one day, is you realise that you and I have written probably the commercially 2 most successful books about the Holocaust. And here we are, just a couple of folks living in Australia writing about that story. So Tom Keneally, the author of Schindler's List. So now you know why Meg was saying her dad used to tell them stories and spin them yarns when they were kids.
Yes.
My very, very best wishes to your parents.
Thank you.
I also met Mum, and you and I, well, we've got a date as soon as I can get to Sydney, which as of today is allowed to happen.
Yay! And thank you, Victoria, so much for taking one for the team and undergoing what you've undergone in terms of restrictions. We're also grateful to you. And we also have a Tahiti date.
Oh, fantastic. When's that?
Well,
oh, yeah, well, our date. Well, we just got to name it. So we'll look at our calendars, we'll work it out, but it's on. We're going to Tahiti. I've never been there.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody.
On Facebook.
Yes. Thank you. And
thank you for having me.
All righty. Bye-bye, folks. And